Amina Davis, a detective haunted by the memory of her father's unpunished death in Lagos, enters the sprawling, sterile mansion of Ji-hoon Park as an invisible domestic worker. Moving through the silent corridors of the Korean underworld, she uses hidden technology to harvest the digital secrets of his global empire. However, the man she observes through her lenses is a study in contradictions. A ruthless kingpin who quietly shields the vulnerable from the very system he commands. When a violent internal coup threatens Ji-hoon's life, Amina must choose between the rigid justice of her badge and the complicated, dangerous man she has come to protect. Their collision unmasks a truth that could topple an empire and redefine the meaning of loyalty. In a mansion where the air smelled of expensive cedar and the heavy, unsaid secrets of men, Ji-hoon Park sat in the suffocating blue glow of his surveillance room. Outside, the Seoul rain drummed against the glass, a relentless rhythmic sound that reminded him of things he had tried to forget. His fingers, scarred from a life of hard choices, traced the edge of a screen. He was not watching his enemies nor his shipments. He was watching his maid, Amina. On the monitor, she moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that the world usually dismissed as mere service. She was the woman his lieutenants called the Ghost, a creature of dust and tea. But tonight she held a device that pulsed with a light that was not for cleaning. Amina Davis had been sent to destroy him, a detective masquerading as the invisible help. She had come for justice, driven by the memory of her father's blood on a Lagos street. But as she peered into the dark corners of Ji-hoon's world, she found not a monster, but a man carrying his own jagged scars. Tomorrow, a conspiracy would explode, threatening to dismantle the city's criminal elite. But tonight, the man who owned everything realized the woman who served him had already stolen the only thing he could not buy. The morning Amina arrived at the Park mansion, the Seoul sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with a dampness that clung to her skin like a second unwanted layer of clothing. She stood before the gates, monstrous things of black iron and silent authority, and felt a familiar sharp tightening in her chest. It was the same feeling she used to get in Lagos, watching the yellow Danfo buses weave through the chaotic dust-choked arteries of the city, where survival was not a choice but a rhythmic necessity. She had dressed with a deliberate studied plainness, a skirt that fell past her knees in a shade of brown so dull it seemed to apologize for its own existence, and a blouse of stiff, inexpensive cotton. She was practicing the art of the unremarkable. In this house she was not Amina Davis, the detective with a mind like a razor and a heart hardened by the unpunished death of her father. She was merely a girl from Africa's most populous country, seeking the quiet indignity of service. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. O, possessed a face that looked as though it had been carved from cold soap, pale, slippery, and entirely devoid of warmth. She led Amina through the foyer, where the air smelled of expensive cedar and the kind of profound silence that only extreme wealth can buy. Mrs. O did not look at Amina's face. She looked at her hands, her shoes, the way she stood. To Mrs. O, Amina was a biological machine, a new set of lungs to breathe in the dust of the powerful. "You will be invisible," Mrs. O said, her voice a dry rattle. "You will move through the rooms like the air. Mr. Park does not like to see the machinery of his comfort." Amina nodded, keeping her gaze lowered, masking the fierce intelligence that danced behind her eyes. She felt the weight of the hidden wire tucked into the lining of her bra, a cold secret against her ribs. Then she saw him. Ji-hoon Park did not enter the room so much as the room rearranged itself to accommodate his presence. He was draped in charcoal silk, his movements possessing the fluid, terrifying grace of a predator who had never known a day of hunger. He stopped, his gaze snagging on her for a fraction of a second, longer than one looks at furniture but shorter than one looks at a human being. In that moment, Amina realized that his eyes were not the eyes of a monster, but of a man who had seen too much of the world's jagged edges. She felt a flicker of something dangerous, a recognition. She lowered her head further, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs as she stepped into the shadows of the hallway, a ghost beginning her haunting. To live in the Park mansion was to inhabit a cathedral of curated silence, a place where even the shadows seemed to have been bought and paid for. Amina moved through the corridors with a light, rhythmic step, the soft swish of her dull skirt the only testament to her presence. She had learned the geography of the house not by its architecture, but by its absences. The moments when the heavy oak doors remained bolted, the minutes when the security team shifted their gaze to light a cigarette or check a message from a girl in Gangnam. She was the ghost in the hall, a creature of dust cloths and lemon-scented wax. To the men who drifted through Ji-hoon's world, men with sharp suits and even sharper eyes, she was as unremarkable as the patterned wallpaper. They spoke of shipping routes and sanitizing assets over her head, their voices carrying the casual arrogance of those who believe that the person cleaning their floors lacks the ears to hear or the mind to understand. In the liminal space between midnight and dawn, when the mansion held its breath, Amina's true work began. Her hands, which spent the day wringing out mops, now moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. She carried her hidden technology, a device no larger than a button, tucked into the hem of her apron. In the library, beneath the heavy scent of old leather and the lingering trail of Ji-hoon's expensive tobacco, she knelt by the wall safe hidden behind a landscape of the Han River. She worked in the dark, her heartbeat a steady, Nigerian drum against the silence of Seoul. The data pulsed from the safe's digital lock into her receiver, a stream of binary secrets that promised to avenge her father. She felt a strange, jagged guilt. It was the same guilt she felt as a child in Lagos when she took an extra piece of chin-chin from her mother's jar. But this was not sweets. This was the slow, methodical dismantling of a man's life. Occasionally, she would hear the heavy tread of Ji-hoon's footsteps above her. He was a man who did not sleep so much as he waited for the sun. Through the vents, she heard the low, melodic rasp of his voice on the phone, a sound that lacked the jagged edges of the monster the briefing files had promised. He spoke to an elderly woman in a hospital, his tone softened by a genuine weary kindness that Amina found difficult to reconcile with the scarred knuckles she saw during the day. She retreated to her small, sparse room before the first gray fingers of light touched the windows, her mind a map of encrypted accounts and hidden routes. She was gathering the stones to build his gallows, yet as she lay in the dark she found herself tracing the shape of his voice in her mind, realizing that in this house of secrets, the greatest mystery was the man himself. The incident happened on a Tuesday, a day when the air in the mansion felt particularly brittle, as if the walls themselves were anticipating a blow. Amina was polishing the mahogany sideboard in the formal dining room, her movements synchronized with the low, steady hum of the central heating. She worked with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent her life learning how to take up as little space as possible. The double doors swung open, and the silence of the room was punctured by the sharp, discordant sound of raised voices. Ji-hoon entered first, his face a mask of such terrifying stillness that Amina felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. Behind him trailed a man named Min-ho, one of the middle-ranking lieutenants who usually carried himself with a preening, oily confidence. Today, however, Min-ho looked diminished, his expensive suit suddenly appearing several sizes too large for his trembling frame. "I was told there were rules, Min-ho," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a register so low it was almost a whisper, yet it carried to the corners of the room like a physical weight. "Rules about who we touch. Rules about who we leave out of our business." Min-ho began to stammer, a frantic, high-pitched sound that reminded Amina of the trapped birds she used to see in the markets of Lagos. He spoke of quotas and missed payments, of a family in the district who had been difficult. Ji-hoon did not raise his voice. He simply reached for a crystal glass sitting on the sideboard, a delicate hand-cut thing that Amina had polished only an hour before. His scarred knuckles turned a bloodless white as he gripped it. "That family has a daughter, Min-ho. She is 6 years old," Ji-hoon said. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "You terrified a child for a handful of one that I do not need. You brought the smell of our world into a place where a girl should be allowed to sleep." Then came the sound, a sharp, sickening crack. The glass shattered in Ji-hoon's hand, the shards biting into his palm, but he did not flinch. Blood began to bloom across his skin, a vivid, startling red that dripped onto the polished floor Amina had worked so hard to clean. "Get out," Ji-hoon said, and Min-ho fled, his footsteps a frantic tattoo against the marble. Ji-hoon stood motionless, staring at his bleeding hand with a look of profound, weary disgust. Amina stepped forward, forgotten in her role as the invisible help, her instinct as a detective, and as a woman who had seen too many men use power only for cruelty, warring with her mission. She reached into her apron for a clean cloth, her heart thudding a rhythmic, heavy beat. When he looked up and caught her gaze, his eyes were not those of a predator, but of a man who found his own reflection unbearable. Amina realized then that his wrath was reserved for the lack of honor, a discovery that made her wire feel heavier, and her purpose suddenly dangerously blurred. In the days that followed, Amina moved through the mansion with a heightened, shimmering awareness, the kind of alertness one only acquires when the stakes of a lie have finally become visible. The memory of the blood on Ji-hoon's hand, that vivid, startling red against the pale marble, stayed with her, an inconvenient smudge on the clean lens of her mission. She found herself watching him not just for the secrets of his empire, but for the fractures in his character, the way he carried his body like a man who found his own skin a bit too tight. Her opportunity came on a Thursday night when the mansion was draped in a silence so thick it felt like velvet. Ji-hoon had left for a meeting in Gangnam, his departure signaled by the low, authoritative growl of his sedan's engine. Amina waited until the rhythmic breathing of the house had settled into the deep, slow cadence of sleep. She ascended the stairs, her feet finding the familiar silent path across the silk carpets, until she stood before the heavy double doors of his private study. The room was cold, smelling of rain and the sharp metallic tang of expensive electronics. On the far wall hung an original landscape of the Han River, a painting of muted grays and blues that Amina had dusted every day for 2 weeks. She moved the frame with a practiced, ghostly touch, revealing the safe embedded in the stone. It was a masterpiece of modern security, a digital fortress that guarded the architecture of his power. She reached into the waistband of her skirt and pulled out a small, flat device, a piece of technology so sophisticated it made the tools she'd used in Legos look like children's toys. It was a signal interceptor, a silent thief. As she pressed it against the safe's keypad, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like betrayal. She was reaching into the most private corners of his life, harvesting the binary evidence of his sins, while only hours ago she had felt a strange, quiet kinship with his weary eyes. The device began to pulse with a faint, rhythmic blue light, a heartbeat in the dark. Numbers flickered across her smartphone screen, a cascade of encrypted codes and offshore account titles. She watched the progress bar crawl forward, her own breathing ragged and uneven. This was the justice she had traveled across continents to find. These were the ghosts of the men who had killed her father, hidden in the spreadsheets of a Korean kingpin. Just as the final file transferred, a document labeled with a name that made her heart stop, she heard the distant, unmistakable sound of the front gates swinging open. Amina froze, the painting still tilted, the blue light of her tech reflecting in her eyes. She realized then that in her search for his secrets, she had left her own vulnerability exposed, and the man returning to the house was no longer a target, but a person whose discovery she feared more than her own failure. The following night, the mansion was a cavern of uneasy silence, the kind of quiet that suggests a held breath. Amina moved through the kitchen, her hands performing the rhythmic, mindless task of preparing Ji-hoon's late-night tea. It was a ritual of jasmine and porcelain, a small ceremony of domesticity that anchored the drifting hours of her undercover life. She was reaching for the honey when she saw him, one of the younger guards, a boy named Juan whose eyes always seemed to be searching for something he had lost. He didn't notice her. To him she was merely a fixture of the room, as unremarkable as the toaster. She watched, stilled by a sudden, sharp intuition as he lingered by the tray. With a movement that was too quick, too practiced, he let a fine silver dust slip from a fold in his sleeve into the steeping pot. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin, smelling of ozone and the sterile scent of betrayal. Amina waited until Juan had retreated into the shadows of the servants' corridor before she stepped toward the tray. She looked at the tea, the dark liquid swirling with a secret that promised a quiet, untraceable end. It was the moment she had been trained for, the moment where the enemy became vulnerable, where the mission could be accelerated by a single convenient death. If Ji-hoon died tonight, the files she had harvested would fall into the hands of the state, and her father's ghost might finally find rest. But then she remembered the cracked glass. She remembered the man who had bled in silence because he could not stomach the terror of a child. She poured the tea into the sink, the liquid gurgling down the drain like a wasted life. With a steady hand she rinsed the pot, her heart a frantic Nigerian drum against her ribs. She brewed a fresh batch, her movements possessed by a fierce, protective urgency she did not fully understand. When she brought the tray into his study, Ji-hoon was slumped over his desk, the blue light of his monitors casting jagged, weary shadows across his face. He looked up, his gaze snagging on her with a faint, tired acknowledgement. "You're late, Amina," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "The water took time to boil, sir," she lied, her voice a soft, unremarkable thread in the silence. She watched him lift the cup, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron. As he drank the safe, clean tea, she realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that she had crossed a line she could not uncross. She was no longer just a detective gathering evidence. She was a ghost who had chosen to become a shield, guarding the man she was sent to destroy. The 3 a.m. hour was a sanctuary of blue shadows and hushed expectations, a time when the weight of one's history felt most acute. Amina found Ji-hoon in the glass-walled sunroom, a space that felt less like a part of a house and more like a transparent cage suspended over the glittering, indifferent lights of Seoul. He was not working tonight. He sat with his head tilted back, watching the rain smear the city into a series of jagged neon watercolors. "It never stops here," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the cool air. "The rain. It feels like a persistent interrogation." Amina set the fresh tray down with a softness born of habit. She did not leave. There was something in the way he slumped, a loosening of the charcoal silk at his shoulders, that made her feel she was no longer looking at the boss, but at the tired boy who had watched his father die in a Busan alley. "In Lagos," she began, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears, stripped of its protective, unremarkable layers, "the rain is different. It does not whisper. It shouts." Ji-hoon turned his head, his dark, observant eyes snagging on hers. He did not look at her as a servant, nor as the invisible ghost of his hallways. He looked at her with a raw, searching curiosity. "Tell me," he said. "It starts with a smell," she said, and for a moment the sterile scent of cedar and floor wax vanished. A heavy, dusty scent of the earth anticipating the water. And when it falls, it is thick and sudden. It hammers against the corrugated zinc roofs of the kiosks, making a sound like 1,000 talking drums. It washes away the red dust from the hibiscus leaves and turns the gutters into rushing rivers. People run for cover, laughing or cursing, huddled under the yellow eaves of the shops. Everything stops, and yet everything feels more alive. She thought of her father, how he would come home with his uniform soaked through, smelling of rain and the honesty of a long day's work. She felt a sharp, jagged pull of grief, a longing for a country that no longer held a place for her. "You miss it," Ji-hoon said. It was not a question. "I miss the version of me that lived there," she replied quietly. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of possibility before he pulled back. "We are both survivors of our family's dreams, Amina. We are both living in countries that treat us as perpetually other." In the heavy, jasmine-scented silence that followed, Amina realized with a terrifying jolt that the man she was sent to destroy understood the shape of her soul better than the agency that had given her a badge. She was no longer just gathering intel, she was sharing the burden of being seen. The following week, the air in the mansion changed. It became thick and metallic, the way the atmosphere in Lagos becomes just before the power grid fails and the neighborhood is plunged into a sudden, expectant dark. Amina felt it in the way the guards moved. Their laughter was too loud, their eyes darting toward the security cameras with a frequency that suggested they were no longer looking for intruders, but for an opening. She was in the laundry room, the rhythmic thrum of the machines a steady pulse beneath her feet, when she overheard the conversation. It was Hwan, the same boy who had tried to lace the jasmine tea, and Lee, a senior lieutenant whose face was always set in a mask of rigid, borrowed authority. They stood in the service corridor, their voices lowered to a conspiratorial rasp that they assumed the invisible help would never decipher. They spoke of the upcoming shipment at the Incheon docks, but it was not the cargo they discussed. It was a clean transition. They used the word with a clinical coldness that made Amina's skin prickle. A transition meant a vacancy. It meant that Ji-hoon, the man who spent his midnights watching the rain and shielding the vulnerable, was being hunted within the very walls he had built for protection. Amina folded a pile of Ji-hoon's silk shirts, her movements methodical and calm, though her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She realized then that the external enemies the agency had briefed her on, the rival crews and the vengeful cartels, were merely the distraction. The true rot was here in the loyalties he believed he had purchased with his honor. She watched the security monitors later that evening, her own hidden receiver patched into the mansion's feed. She saw the subtle discrepancies. The way the perimeter cameras were being looped, a 3-second lag that would be unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for a ghost. They were creating a blind spot, a sanctuary for a strike. A sharp, jagged fear sliced through her professional detachment. If she reported this to her handlers, they would tell her to let the internal war play out. A dead kingpin was easier to prosecute than a living one. But she thought of the way Ji-hoon had looked at her in the sunroom, the raw honesty of his weariness, and she knew she could not let him be slaughtered by men who lacked the spine to face him. She was a detective sent to gather evidence of his sins, but as she moved toward his study in the deepening shadows, she understood that her mission had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just observing a monster. She was the only one who realized the predator was about to become the prey. The following night, the humidity in Seoul felt like a damp cloth pressed against the mouth, a weight that made every movement feel labored. Amina found Ji-hoon in the private gym, a space of cold steel and unforgiving mirrors. He was shirtless, his back to her, and for the first time the invisible help saw the geography of his history written in his skin. He did not startle when she entered with the customary water and towel. He simply stopped his rhythmic striking of the heavy bag, his breathing a jagged, heavy sound in the sterile room. Across his back was a sprawling, intricate mural of ink, dragons and tigers in Korean script that coiled around his ribs like a second skeleton. But it was not the ink that held Amina's gaze. It was the scars. They were raised, pale lines that intersected the art, a violent shorthand for every betrayal he had survived. "You're looking at the biography of my mistakes," Ji-hoon said, turning to face her. His chest was a map of puckered skin and faded burns, the kind of marks that only come from a world where mercy is a foreign currency. "In my country, we say that a man who has no scars has never truly left his mother's house," Amina said softly, her voice a steady thread in the quiet. She set the tray down, her eyes tracking a particularly deep mark near his collarbone, the shape of a jagged star. Ji-hoon traced the line of a scar on his forearm, his expression one of weary, clinical detachment. "I was 19 when I watched my father's throat cut in an alley. They thought they were eliminating a rival. What they actually did was create a son who understood that power is the only thing that keeps the knife away." He looked at her then, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw, searching honesty. "Every tattoo is a promise I made to a dead man. Every scar is the price I paid for keeping it. You think I'm a monster, Amina?" She thought of the files she had harvested, the digital evidence of his sins. But she also thought of the jasmine tea and the way he spoke of the rain. "I think you are a man who has lived in the dark for so long that you have forgotten there are other ways to see," she replied. He moved closer, the scent of sweat and expensive soap clinging to him. For a heartbeat, the distance between the boss and the maid vanished, replaced by the heavy, shimmering tension of two people who had spent their lives armored in deception. Ji-hoon reached out, his thumb brushing a small, faded scar on Amina's own wrist, a remnant of a Lagos childhood. "We both carry the marks of our survival, don't we?" The recognition was a sharp, jagged thing, more intimate than a touch. Amina realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that their scars were the only honest things in a house built on lies. And the price of his empire was a loneliness she was beginning to share. The following afternoon, the air felt thick and humid, a heavy blanket that smelled of damp pavement and the impending rain that always seemed to be lurking at the edges of Seoul. Amina sat in a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop in Itaewon, a place where the music was too loud and the patrons too transient to notice a woman whose eyes were as weary as hers. Across from her sat Miller, her handler, a man whose face possessed the smooth, forgettable quality of a polished stone. He drank his Americano with a clinical detachment that made Amina's stomach turn. "We're moving the timeline up, Amina," Miller said, his voice a low, rhythmic hum beneath the upbeat pop music. "The Incheon shipment is the play. We need the final encrypted keys to the logistics server. By Friday, Ji-hoon Park should be a memory, and you should be on a flight back to DC." Amina looked at her reflection in the dark surface of her tea. She looked like a stranger. The girl from Lagos was buried beneath layers of American training and the quiet, invisible mask of a maid. "The situation inside the mansion is volatile," she said, her voice a soft thread in the noise. "There is an internal coup brewing. If we strike now, we aren't just taking down a network. We're walking into a slaughterhouse." Miller leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. That's not our concern. Our concern is the data. You've spent months building a biography of this man's sins. Don't tell me you're starting to care about the shape of his soul. The word soul sounded foreign coming from him, a jagged piece of glass in a mouth used to speaking in cold, tactical binaries. Amina thought of the gym, the scars that intersected Ji-hoon's tattoos like a map of survival. She thought of the tea she had poured down the sink and the 3 a.m. rain. He isn't what the files said, she said quietly. He is exactly what the files said, Miller countered, his tone hardening. He is a criminal kingpin with blood on his hands. Any mercy you've witnessed is just strategic marketing. We need that data, Amina. Your father didn't die so you could become the guardian of a Korean monster. The mention of her father was a sharp, familiar pull of grief, a rhythmic ache she had carried across oceans. But for the first time it didn't feel like a command, it felt like a manipulation. She realized then that she was being squeezed between 2 systems of power, both of which viewed her as an instrument rather than a human being. As she walked back toward the mansion, the red dust of her memory swirling with the gray fog of the city, Amina understood that the choice was no longer about justice or duty. It was about whether she would remain a ghost in someone else's machine or finally become the architect of her own loyalty. The Incheon docks were a skeletal landscape of rusted shipping containers and the relentless salt-heavy wind that whipped off the Yellow Sea. Amina sat in the passenger seat of a black SUV, her hands resting with a forced, unnatural stillness on her lap. Beside her, Ji-hoon was a study in cold, sharp angles, his charcoal coat buttoned high against the spray. They were there for a routine settlement, a rhythmic exchange of paper and promises that Amina knew, with a sickening metallic certainty, was a theater for his end. She had tried to warn him, but the language of a maid is not the language of a kingpin, and her words had been dismissed as the nervous flutterings of a woman who did not belong in the dark. Now the silence of the docks felt wrong, too hollow, too intentional. The air was suddenly punctured by the sharp, discordant crack of a sniper's round shattering the SUV's windshield. It happened with the terrifying, fluid speed of a nightmare. The doors to the surrounding containers swung open and men, Ji-hoon's own men, led by the oily, frantic Hwan, poured out like shadows given form. The driver was slumped over the wheel, a vivid, startling red blooming across the leather headrest. Ji-hoon moved with the grace of a predator, his hand already reaching for the weapon tucked into his waistband, but he was too slow. A second shot grazed his shoulder and he collapsed into the salt-crusted gravel. "Stay in the car, Amina," he shouted, his voice a raw, jagged rasp. But Amina did not stay. She watched through the cracked glass as Hwan approached, his face twisted in a mask of borrowed, desperate authority. They did not kill him. They dragged him toward a waiting van, their movements possessed by a clinical, hurried efficiency. They wanted him alive for the interrogation, for the keys to the empire they intended to steal. The van roared to life, its tires screaming against the asphalt, leaving behind only the smell of burnt rubber and the heavy, suffocating scent of betrayal. Amina stood in the center of the docks, the rain finally beginning to fall in thick, rhythmic drops that reminded her of Lagos. She was alone. Her team was miles away, waiting for a signal she hadn't sent. Her target was gone. Her protector was taken. She looked down at the gravel where his blood merged with the oily puddles, and she felt the mask of the invisible help shatter. She was no longer the ghost in the hall or the unremarkable girl with a dust cloth. She reached into her skirt, pulling out the encrypted phone that connected her to a world of violence she had tried to pretend she only observed. As she watched the taillights vanish into the gray fog, Amina realized that the only thing left of her mission was the lie she lived, and the only way to save the man she was sent to destroy was to finally become the dangerous woman she had always been. Amina stood in the center of Itaewon, where the smell of roasting meat and the frantic neon pulse of the city felt like a mockery of the cold, salt-crusted silence she had left behind at the docks. She did not call Miller. To call the agency was to admit that the mission had collapsed into a series of jagged, irreparable shards. Instead, she went to a small, windowless basement restaurant tucked behind a row of flashy beauty boutiques, a place where the air was thick with the scent of fermented locust beans and the melodic, rapid-fire rhythm of Yoruba. In this room, she was no longer the invisible maid or the American-trained phantom. She was a daughter of the soil who had come to collect a debt of solidarity. She found Chinidu, A man whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of the used engines he sold, but whose eyes held the weary, watchful intelligence of someone who had survived 3 continents. They took him, Chinidu, she said, her voice dropping into a register of raw, unvarnished urgency. The man who ensured the immigration officers looked away from your shop. The man who paid for your cousin's surgery when the state said no. Chinidu did not ask why a maid cared about a mafia kingpin. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. Within minutes, the invisible machinery of the diaspora began to hum. It was a mobilization of the overlooked. The delivery drivers who hummed through the city on silent motorbikes, the cleaning crews moving through the high-rises of Gangnam, the factory workers in the industrial fringes of Gyeonggi-do. Amina sat at a scarred wooden table, her phone a glowing conduit for 1,000 fragments of intelligence. This was the army the agency had never accounted for. The people who saw everything precisely because no one bothered to see them. A text arrived from a Ghanaian brother working the night shift at a toll booth. A black van with a dented fender heading north. A photo from a Nigerian student on a delivery run. Juan's face caught in the glare of a convenience store's fluorescent light. The red dust of her memories seemed to swirl with the cold Seoul rain as she mapped the trajectory of the betrayal. She realized then that power was not just about the guns one owned or the offshore accounts Amina had harvested. It was about the threads of loyalty that bind the discarded to the indispensable. As she rose from the table, a heavy, cold pistol now tucked into the small of her back, Amina understood that she was no longer just a detective. She was a general of the invisible, leading an army of ghosts to reclaim a man who had been the only one to see her as human. The warehouse was a skeletal structure of rusted corrugated iron and the sharp metallic tang of industrial decay, tucked into a corner of Gyeonggi-do that the world had forgotten to name. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and the low rhythmic thrum of a generator that sounded like a dying pulse. Amina moved through the perimeter with a terrifying, fluid silence. She was no longer the girl who adjusted silk pillows or lowered her gaze when the powerful walked by. She was the architect of a different kind of order. She held the pistol with a practiced, easy familiarity, a cold, heavy weight that felt like a natural extension of her arm. It was a weapon she had learned to use in a basement in Virginia, dreaming of the men who had killed her father in Lagos. But tonight she held it for a man who sat bound to a metal chair in the center of the room. Ji-hoon was bruised, his charcoal coat torn, his face a map of vivid, startling red welts, but his eyes remained alert, tracking the shadows with a calcified defiance. Juan stood over him, his voice a frantic, high-pitched rasp as he demanded codes to servers that no longer existed. He was a small man trying to fill a large space, his hand shaking as he pointed a gun at Ji-hoon's chest. Amina did not shout. She stepped into the light of a single flickering bulb, her presence a sudden, sharp puncture in the tension. Juan turned, his mask of borrowed authority slipping into a look of profound, stupid confusion. He saw the maid. He saw the ghost. "Put it down, Juan," she said, her voice a low, steady thread that carried more authority than a scream ever could. "You," Juan stammered, his eyes darting toward her weapon. "You're just a cleaner. A foreign girl." "I am the person who has been watching you for 6 months," she replied, and for the first time she allowed the full, fierce intelligence of her gaze to snag on his. "I know the name of your mistress in Incheon. I know about the 3 million won you skimmed from the transport accounts. I know you are too weak for the chair you are trying to steal." When Juan lunged, his movements were clumsy, fueled by a panicked desperation. Amina moved with the clinical efficiency of someone who had spent her life anticipating the jagged edges of violence. She fired once. The sound was a deafening, discordant crack that shattered the warehouse's silence. Juan collapsed, not dead but diminished, the bullet finding his shoulder with surgical precision. Amina approached Ji-hoon, her heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against her ribs. She cut his restraints, her fingers brushing the scarred skin of his wrists with a softness that felt like a confession. As he stood, swaying slightly, he looked at her. Really looked at her, and she saw the shock in his eyes dissolve into a raw, searching recognition. "You were never just air, were you, Amina?" he whispered, his voice a melodic rasp. "Air is what keeps you alive, Ji-hoon," she said quietly. "But sometimes, it is also what carries the fire." The silence of the safe house was different from the silence of the mansion. It was not curated or bought, but raw and thin, like a garment that had been washed too many times. They sat in a room that smelled of dust and old wood, the only light a singular flickering bulb that made their shadows stretch and bleed into one another. Ji-hoon sat on the edge of a narrow bed, his charcoal coat discarded, the vivid red of his wounds now clumsily bandaged with cloth Amina had torn from her own unremarkable skirt. He watched her as she disassembled her weapon, her movements possessed by a clinical, terrifying grace. He did not look like a maid. She looked like a woman who had spent her life learning how to dismantle things. "You were a spy," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the hollow space between them. It was not a question, but a weary acknowledgement of a truth that had been sitting in the room long before the first gunshot at the docks. Amina stilled, her hands resting on the cold steel of the pistol. She looked up, and for the first time she did not lower her gaze. The mask of the invisible ghost had vanished, replaced by the fierce, observant intelligence of a woman who had traveled across oceans to find justice. "I was a detective, Ji-hoon," she said, her voice a steady thread in the quiet. "I was sent to harvest the digital biography of your sins. I was the ghost in your hall, the one gathering the stones for your gallows." Ji-hoon traced the line of a fresh scar on his wrist, a jagged shorthand for the betrayal he had just survived. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw, searching honesty. "And the 3 a.m. rain? Was that part of the mission? Was the version of you that I saw merely a strategic performance?" "No," Amina replied, and the word felt heavy, a stone dropped into a deep well. "The mission was the lie. But the choice to pour the poison down the drain, that was real. You were a target, but you became a person. I saw the way you shielded the vulnerable, and I realized that the system I serve does not know how to account for a man who carries his own jagged scars with honor." Ji-hoon moved closer, the scent of salt and exhaustion clinging to him. He reached out, his thumb brushing the small, faded scar on Amina's wrist. "You were a spy," he whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp vulnerability, "but you saved me. You destroyed my invisibility, and in doing so you gave me back my life." The recognition was a sharp, jagged thing, more intimate than a touch. Amina realized then that they were no longer bound by the roles of boss and maid, nor detective and criminal. They were two damaged people standing in the ruins of their deceptions, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than the truth was the love that had already taken root in the shadows. They left Seoul when the air was beginning to turn, the humid weight of summer giving way to a crisp, expectant autumn that smelled of wood smoke and dried leaves. They did not go back to the mansion with its curated silences and its blood-stained marble. Instead, they sought the salt-drenched air of a coastal town where the Atlantic hammered against the shore with a familiar rhythmic ferocity. In this new space, the geography of their lives was no longer defined by the binary of the hunter and the prey. Amina no longer carried the heavy, cold weight of a state-issued badge, and Ji-hoon no longer wore the charcoal silk of a kingpin. They lived in a house filled with light and the unhurried sounds of a life being reclaimed. The architecture of their new world was built on the ruins of their deceptions. Amina realized that justice was not a thing that lived in a sterile office in Virginia or in the unpunished memories of a Lagos street. It was something one cultivated in the small daily choices to protect the overlooked. Together they used the digital keys Amina had harvested, the sprawling binary biography of an empire, not to destroy but to redistribute. The wealth that had been built on the shadows of the underworld began to flow, in quiet, untraceable streams, toward the very people the system had deemed invisible. It paid for the legal fees of the discarded and the school uniforms of children whose fathers had vanished into the industrial fringes of Gyeonggi-do. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ocean in vivid, startling streaks of violet and gold, Ji-hoon sat on the porch, his hands no longer gripped around a cracked crystal glass. He watched Amina as she moved through the garden, her feet finding a rhythmic path through the hibiscus and the red dust she had brought with her in her mind. "We are still ghosts, aren't we?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "We are the best kind of ghosts, Ji-hoon," she replied, stopping to look at him with a gaze that was no longer a mask. "We are the ones who make sure the machinery of power doesn't crush the people it pretends not to see." She moved toward him, her hand finding his, her thumb tracing the scarred shorthand of his survival. They were two damaged people who had refused to let their worst moments define their final forms. In the deepening twilight, they understood that their mission had not ended. It had simply evolved. They were building a world where the shape of one's soul mattered more than the badge one wore or the empire one commanded. A world where they were finally, dangerously and beautifully visible to one another.